To begin with, I'd like to thank Shannon for such a generous welcome to country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present. And after Adrian's introduction to me, I don't think there's much more I can say other than to say hello. I've been asked to talk about community housing and the role that it can play in the housing system now and into the future. So I want to start by saying that community housing isn't a funding program. It's housing by the community, for the community, embedded in communities, responding to communities' needs and interests and opportunities. So I'm going to use the word community a lot, I think. So when I say community housing, I mean it very broadly. So it's not a sort of a tightly defined term. It's quite a loosely defined term. So it includes things like affordable housing. It includes social housing for people on very low incomes, housing solutions for people at risk of homelessness or needing emergency or transitional accommodation, and more, pretty much anything, any kind of housing that's delivered by not-for-profit community-based organisations. And the reason that we're talking about community housing is that it's the part of the social housing system which has been growing and which is poised to take on an even more significant role in addressing the housing affordability crisis here in Queensland and elsewhere. So as we've heard from the Minister, under the current National Affordable Housing Agreement, all states and territories are committed to transferring up to a third of their public housing properties into community housing management. I think only Tasmania is in any danger of doing that by the 2014 deadline, but here recently and restated today, the Queensland Government has made a very bold commitment to transfer the management of in the order of 90% of public housing properties to community housing, and that's on top of some pretty notable growth in the community housing industry here over the past few years, pretty much doubling overnight with the nation building properties and more than tripling in size since 2009. So it's pretty topical, community housing, but it makes me think, if community housing is the answer, what was the question? And it's a rhetorical question, but I'm going to take it seriously and try to answer a few different versions of it. So the first version, and it is the issue of the day, who can manage the social housing portfolio in a new way? So let's look at it. So when governments and housing activists and academic researchers and public policymakers and many others look at our very unsystematic housing system and at the role being played by public housing, they find themselves saying, we have to do this differently. And Alice is right, that we don't have to imagine when it might work, how it could look when it works. It's actually worked in the past. So there's some examples from the past as well as imagining doing things differently in the future. And since the 1980s, community housing has been part of the answer to that particular question. And this is not about government exiting the field. It's about government deciding to carry out its responsibilities and meet community expectations through the community sector rather than directly, or perhaps as well as directly. And again, Minister Manda made a comment earlier today about government as a facilitator or an enabler rather than a direct deliverer. And this isn't the thing that's particularly special to the housing industry. It's part of a more general move away from direct service provision by governments. We're seeing it in disability services and out-of-home care for children and a whole lot of other service areas. And I think it's also some other bits of the context are governments around the country thinking about their assets, like their social housing portfolio, in new ways, in the context of budget deficits or difficulties, changing priorities, different ways of thinking about whether you need to own something and manage it in order to get the job done that you need done. And noting too that, especially in the case of a social housing portfolio, if you've ignored it for a really long time, it's incredibly expensive to maintain. It requires borrowing or direct new investment from the state's budget or both just to maintain the portfolio, let alone expand it, and we know that it needs to expand, and the Queensland Commission of Audit is a perfect example of this. And I suppose too, just another little tweak on that for social housing, it's linked to some of those features of our taxation system and our income support system. So, for example, community housing tenants have access to Commonwealth rent assistance like eligible private rental tenants, while public housing tenants don't. So one of the versions of my rhetorical question is actually being asked by governments, all the time, even as we speak, who can I get to help me manage this and help me manage this better? It's another version of the same sort of question. And let's look at the issue of Commonwealth rent assistance directly, because there's a couple of important aspects. We do tend to focus on the most obvious, which is that rent assistance is available within community housing but not within public housing. So we compare community and public housing, and every now and again we get the shivers and think, what if the Commonwealth Treasury notices? And they've absolutely noticed, and it's a question of whether they consider that to be the right way to continue to invest, and I hope that they do. And I do think that's an important point, but it also masks another important comparison between community housing and private landlords. So if you want to know who can get the best value out of Commonwealth rent assistance, the answer is a community housing landlord. Commonwealth rent assistance for private tenants, and I'm not advocating ending that because it's important. You know, the private rental market is the hardest place to find yourself a home. But in the private sector, rent assistance is open to the criticism that private landlords simply raise the rent to the same amount of the Commonwealth rent assistance payment. I'm not imputing any wickedness on the part of landlords, it's just the way the market works. So in the private market, basically rent assistance into the landlord's pocket. But in the community housing sector, what that means is that rent assistance is in the hands of an organisation whose whole purpose is to use all of their funding to produce more housing. So it's actually rent assistance at its most valuable and I believe at its most effective. NRAS. So the National Rental Affordability Scheme offers investors, private or community-based, a subsidy for 10 years to rent new properties out at less than full market rent to people on moderate incomes. Summary. It's a great program, it's working, and there's strong support for the Commonwealth Government, the present government, or whoever we get after September, to make the program a permanent fixture of our housing system. It's something that's already effective and will be far more effective if it's made permanent rather than just a one-off or a couple of blobs every now and again. But you do have to notice that where private investors are involved, after the 10-year subsidy period, the party is over, rents will go back up and tenants will have to pay more or move. But not where community housing providers are involved. So not only is the case that community housing organisations offer a greater discount to rent on the rents than their private counterparts, they're also far more likely to retain NRAS properties as social or affordable housing in perpetuity. That's the evidence that's coming from the way that community housing providers are packaging up NRAS with other forms of subsidy, with other funding and including investments from their own balance sheets. So if you want to know who makes NRAS really work, the answer is community housing. This version of my rhetorical question is actually being asked by local government and planners and others in various places around the country. So it's sometimes the case that local councils want to get involved in creating more affordable housing directly in their local area, but they rarely want to manage it themselves. They might not even want to own it, but even if they want to own it, they probably don't want to turn themselves into a landlord. They certainly want it to be well managed, housing the right people, delivering the affordability that they're seeking. And community housing is a great answer for that, which is why, amongst other things, before BHC was BHC, it was the Brisbane Housing Company, reflecting the commitment of the Brisbane City Council and others to do something about housing affordability and choosing to do it through the community sector. And on other models and in other places, there's a whole bunch of planning instruments that might require, for instance, a proportion of a new housing development to be set aside for affordable housing, or financial contributions generated when developers are turning low-income properties into more expensive properties and having to make financial contributions to offset the loss of that affordability. So local councils, local councillors, local communities are more confident that these properties or this funding will be used for affordable housing in perpetuity when it's in the hands of community housing providers as opposed to, say, the private developer. You find that communities are much more confident to partner with a community-based organisation than with the state government or with the private sector. This is probably the last version of the question that we've got time to ask today. Who can manage a diverse portfolio for investors? So one of the challenges for Australia's housing system is to try to attract institutional investors into residential rental. It's basically just not there at the moment. It's key to getting sufficient new properties built, so just the supply gap, but also to get the right properties built for an affordable rental market, not just for the homeowner market. So that's to say, to build properties for everybody. And institutional investors, if they're going to invest in and own as an asset class a portfolio of residential rental properties, they need to know that it will be well managed by professional landlords who are skilled at managing a diverse range of tenancies. And community housing providers are ideally placed to play this role, bringing their skills in managing tenancies for low and moderate income people, their skills in managing diverse communities, and their professional approach to reporting and accountability. So that would see, I'm imagining their community housing providers establishing themselves as a new class of social landlords operating across social and affordable housing, as well as really engaging in the private rental market. I could go on, but I think by now you've probably got the picture that community housing makes a tremendous contribution to a whole range of social and affordable housing activities, going as far as carrying the bulk of the load in many areas. And in fact, around the country here and elsewhere, providers are already doing these things. But the need is great. We have a housing affordability crisis which isn't going away and which won't go away without concerted effort from all the players across a range of approaches. And it's clear that community housing has the capacity to play a far greater role, and people are asking these questions that I've posed this morning, and they are looking to community housing to be part of the answer. So it's time to ask another question. How do we get there? What do we actually have to do to turn community housing from what it currently is into something that's capable of playing an even greater role? And I do want to note that community housing is already playing a significant role in many of these areas, so it's not like we have to invent something that's new. We kind of just have to turbocharge something that's already there. So the question, I suppose, is around the resources, the supports and the policy settings that we really need to make the most of what community housing has to offer. And to me, this is the question. It's not an in-principle, theoretical, what-ify kind of a question. It's a practical question that drives action. What do we need to do? Especially for me, because I work in an industry peak body, and we have a big responsibility for resourcing our members so that they can continue to grow and develop their businesses and take advantage of all those opportunities, large and small, to make an impact. So what does it mean? What's required? I said at the start that community housing is not a single funding program. It's an approach. It's an attitude, if you like. It's housing the community, which can lead to very diverse, complex businesses as community housing providers seek to respond to the needs of their communities, whether we think of those as geographical communities, people in this area who need this kind of housing, or tenant groups or target groups or areas of expertise, communities of interest. So we don't need to think of communities as just geographically based. So from a resourcing point of view, this makes it important to support community housing providers as businesses. So, for example, with risk management tools and governance training and advice, financial advice, scenario planning, more effective ways of measuring tenant satisfaction, more effective ways of engaging with tenants and making them truly part of the organisation. It also makes it important to help community housing providers develop the tools and good practice that they need, not just to manage tenancies and properties well, but to deliver support services or work in partnership with others who do that, to undertake long-term portfolio planning, acquisitions, redevelopments, disposals, taking the assets seriously, because you only have to look at public housing to notice what happens if you don't do that. And I don't think we need to recreate that. Other tools and good practice that community housing providers will need are around developing new programs for tenants to help them perhaps find work or study, to help them create the opportunities for voluntary connections between tenants and their neighbours who may or may not be tenants, because those are the things that really help build a community. And I suppose too, from a policy point of view, it means that governments need to acknowledge the diversity of community housing providers' business, acknowledge that they're not all the same, and furthermore, I think it's important to appreciate that that diversity is not a problem that needs to be fixed, but actually a valuable resource that we want to keep. Following on from the previous point, so we can maximise the impact that community housing providers make by ensuring their capacity to operate flexibly, to be innovative, to be responsive to the needs of their tenants and their prospective tenants and the communities that they're operating in. Community housing providers are not best thought of as little versions of public housing or even medium-sized or large-scale replicas of public housing. We know that public housing is unsustainable and increasingly residualised and delivers concentrated disadvantage and doesn't give tenants any greater capacity in many places to do something that they might want to do with their lives. So we're looking for something different. And it would be counterintuitive, I think, to ask community housing to do something different and then require providers to be as much like public housing as possible. So by all means, let's set standards for access and eligibility, and let's decide what affordable means. Let's require high levels of transparency and accountability. Let's not require sameness. So, for example, in the context of tenanted property transfers, the challenge is to engage with tenants about what community housing will bring, not to try to tell them that it will be exactly the same. It's a more complex conversation. It requires a whole lot of the skills that Alice outlined and a whole lot of time and effort put in, but it's a more real and honest conversation, and it's more useful because in a conversation like that, you actually get to find out what tenants want and what their priorities are and figure out how to meet that as much as possible. I was going to talk a little bit about some of the research that the Federation's doing about tenanted transfers and our early findings, but I'll skip that in the interest of time and get to my last point. The third issue that we need to look at in order to maximise the impact of community housing is the issue of scale. Now, this might sound a little bit circular. More community housing means more community housing can do more, true, but it's not a one-to-one equation. I think that's the important point. There's there's an accelerator in there, or thresholds beyond which community housing can suddenly do more than just more. So as individual community housing providers grow and achieve a certain scale, they have the resources to diversify their businesses and expand the range of services they offer. So it's not just about more, it's about better. And I think too, as individual or perhaps groups of community housing providers achieve a certain scale, and I do want to emphasise the idea of groups there because we are seeing group structures emerge in the community housing industry. It doesn't always have to be about amalgamations. It's not always a choice between stay as I am or somehow manage to grow tremendously big by myself or get amalgamated with someone else. It's about partnerships amongst the industry, if you like, to get the benefit of scale and size where that's really efficient, systems, back of house stuff, things like that perhaps, and also to retain that vital localness where that's what's important to really making a difference. So as individual or groups of organisations achieve scale, they also become a viable option for managing properties funded and owned by institutional investors, as I noted before, or even, I suppose, when we look at the industry as a whole continuing to grow, then it becomes a new asset class for things like superannuation funds or overseas investors as well. And that might start to attract the significant finance that leveraged off existing government and new government investment, but really making much more out of that. And I do think, two further little points on scale, it also means that there's more room in the whole system so that we don't face as many really difficult questions about who to target, how needy do you need to be, what else do you need to bring other than just not being able to afford housing in order to have half the chance of being housed in social housing sometime this decade. And I also think that with a larger system and a more mixed system, there's less pressure to limit tenure and to make people move on. So that question that was raised for the Minister this morning, why are we moving people on if they're making a success of their lives? Yeah, good question. And some people can move on. But if we want mixed portfolios and mixed communities and mixed tenure, then I think we can imagine different ways of reducing a subsidy or a more flexible subsidy that doesn't just force people to move out of their homes when they're going okay, which was the thing that we gave them the home to do in the first place. So I think probably that's it from me. That's my summary. Clearly the housing affordability crisis that we're facing doesn't lend itself to simple answers or even three-word dot points. Sorry about that. If it was that straightforward, we'd have the thing fixed already by now. But I hope I've been able to sketch out for you some of the roles that community housing can play and the value of being able to grow that. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and talking more to you about this throughout the rest of the conference. Thank you.